There you go.
Looks like we're just about to go live on YouTube here, Charles.
Yeah, it looks good.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, showing at the top there. Great. All right. Well, should we get going here? I'm gonna hit record.
Let's get going.
Give me one more second here. Oh, funny, I don't see the record button right now. I'm gonna play with that for a second. Oh, there we go. Okay.
Yeah. So welcome everybody to Becoming Naturally Resilient. Great to see so many folks, so many familiar faces, so many new faces. Yeah, welcome to tonight. So Chris and I, we talk, we connect now and again, and it often I find that we are cut from a similar cloth of optimism. Like this is an uncertain time. Like the world seems to be this moment of kind of uncertainty with earthquakes and storms and kind of political upheaval and environmental stuff, all this going on, and not feeling hopeless in it all. And we wanted to share some of our optimism, like not just blanket optimism, but what can we do? Like how can we take care of ourselves and our communities, the natural world around us, and what are some of the strategies we have, and how do we approach this to kind of keep us moving? So that's what tonight's about. We're going to open tonight, and Chris is going to start off talking about some of the challenges and some of the changes, and how do we kind of step into some of this practice. We'll talk about some of the opportunities coming up if you want to do more work with Chris or I, or study with us in our organizations. I'll talk a bit about ecology and how we might be able to get inspired by ecology and see what's happening in the natural world as an analog to how humans might interact with it. And then at the end, we're going to have some time for conversation and engagement. All in all, this will be about an hour and a half is what we're thinking for tonight. So if you're ready, I think we can get started.
Awesome. Thanks, Charles, for welcoming. And just a reminder for those that are just tuning in, we are live streaming this on YouTube right now. And if you're not comfortable with your camera showing on YouTube in the replay, you may want to turn your camera off, although you're more than welcome to learn it on. I definitely feel encouraged seeing other faces when I'm talking into the screen here. So to start us off tonight, we're going to be diving into some kind of intense and heavy topics. And, we're not going to be diving in a scary way. This is definitely not going to be a fear-based thing, but it's more about, proactively and positively facing, what I consider some of the biggest challenges of our time. So that's where we're going tonight with our call. So before we dive in, I would really like to start things off on a positive note and just get ourselves in a good headspace for the night and start things off with a little bit of gratitude. I've really come to recognize gratitude as, a survival skill in and of itself, and such a powerful tool. So I'd like to just kind of maybe bring our minds together for a moment here in gratitude for the natural world and all that it does to support our lives and our well-being. I think about the waters. I'm so grateful to live in a part of the world where there's clean water, there's relatively clean air and clean soil. I think about all of the species that support my life here, the trees, the birds, the plants, the amphibians, the insects. There's just so much in this natural world. And I just want to kind of extend out a blanket gratitude to all of those things because they support us, in more than just our physical way. Intact ecosystems directly impact our resiliency, in changing times, so they support us physically that way. But they also support us mentally and spiritually in such powerful ways as well, And I just think about the number of times that I've been going through a tough place in life and kind of struggling, and being able to go and sit out in a natural space and how an answer has just come to me, or suddenly I found perspective. So I'd like to just kind of share that as a blanket gratitude for the natural world and all it gives to us and the way that it supports us. And I wonder if you folks will join me in that tonight. Does that feel good to you in starting us off tonight? I really, really strongly believe that our relationship with the land plays such an important role in our resiliency as a species, our resiliency as communities. And I think deepening that relationship and that knowledge is going to be pivotal going forward in adapting to some of the challenges we're facing. maybe I'll even do this really quick just for fun. Why don't you write in the chat something you're feeling grateful for tonight? I would love to just get a bunch of gratitudes tossed down in the chat. So if you feel like throwing something you're grateful for in the chat, feel free to do that right now. The next thing I'd love to just kind of acknowledge and share gratitude for is people. People like yourself that are showing up tonight and that are actually willing to walk forward with courage and kind of face some of the big challenges of the times, in a positive way, in a proactive way. I want to acknowledge the people that are actually trying to do their best in challenging times. The people of the past that have lived through very challenging times, the people of present that are doing their best to move forward in a good way, to not get kind of sucked into the darkness, and to still walk their vision and live their gifts. And thanks to the future generations as well. As I say that, it kind of makes me think of a conversation I had with a mentor of mine. It was about a year ago, and we were having a pretty heavy conversation about just some of the stuff going on in the world, and we were in a kind of heavy place with it. We were identifying a lot of things we were worried about, a lot of stuff around just injustices we saw and suffering. It was a heavy conversation. And my mentor actually said to me, he's like, hey, we've been talking about all these heavy things. He's like, what gives you hope right now? What inspires you? And I sat there for a couple of minutes thinking about it because I was kind of in this dark spot. I almost forgot about all those other pieces for a moment. And I was in a bit of a gloomy mindset. And I started thinking about, one, the power of the natural world to actually heal and recover. This earth has seen so many traumatic things that will wipe an ecosystem clean. And 100 years later, it's back and it's resilient and strong again. So I thought about that on the land, but I also thought about that in the people, And it was funny, the moment that I thought about that, this word came to me, and it was indigenous spirit rising. And something that's been filling me with hope lately is, I think a lot of us, I hope at least a lot of us on this call are familiar with, the tragedy of what's been forced and the oppression of indigenous peoples around the world. These people that hold some of the original teachings around connection to the land, people that hold these ancient teachings around stewarding the land in a good way, and how do we live in balance with the land? And, almost anywhere you go on planet Earth, there's stories of, indigenous people being oppressed. Where I happen to live here, I'm in Canada, an area known as Muskoka. And I'm in the current Williams Treaty territory. Williams Treaty is with a certain group of the Anishinaabe peoples. But it was also territory in the past and present, of many other peoples, the Huron, the Wendat, probably several nations I'm not even aware of. So I'd like to just take a moment right now to really extend my gratitude to, one, the peoples that have taken care of this land for thousands and tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of years, and have carried that wisdom forward. And I want to acknowledge, how amazing it is that even after all the oppression and the tragedy, that spirit continues to grow and be here, and I'm seeing some amazing things happening where I live right now, of people stepping up to try and support that wisdom being able to grow. So I just wanted to kind of share that right now, and that feels really good to me. And then maybe the last thing I'll share before we kind of dive into tonight's main topic and content is just recognize and acknowledging the work that still needs to be done there. That's been a big part of my past. Something that's been a big part of my mind is, my ancestors aren't from this land. I come from across the big sea, from Europe, from Hungary, Scotland, specifically in Hungary. And I've landed here with, a relatively easy life compared to, I think, what some of my ancestors have lived. And I know that came at a consequence of some of the people here. So as I kind of acknowledge, that indigenous spirit rising and the harms of the path, I also just want to recognize the need to continue to do work as we go forward to right the wrongs of the past the best we can. I don't know if we can truly right them, but to do our best to reconcile and move forward in a good way. So I just wanted to kind of start off by speaking those words tonight. And hopefully some of you will feel good about joining me in those words. And anything I missed, I'll just put a blanket out there for anything I missed. And feel free to share anything you'd like about that in the chat as we start to dive in. So I'm going to start us off tonight. And the first thing I want to share a little bit about too is this idea of just kind of reframing the story around disasters, reframing the story around climate change, reframing the story around around change in the world. What I kind of find here, I'm going to actually share a slide. Give me a half second here right now. When I start to think about, these topics, they're quite heavy, and they can be quite intimidating. And one tool that has been really helpful for me is to actually kind of zoom back and look out at, time and history off of a longer span. And that's actually helped me kind of get out of this paradigm that I'm going to share in this first slide here. I don't really have an official name for this yet. I was kind of thinking about what I want to call it. So I just called it the pendulum of awareness and action. And, on the left here, I know a lot of people that, don't believe that there are any real issues right now, and kind of just believe that, AI and whatever human ingenuity is going to solve all our problems. And, climate isn't changing, the environment's fine. And even if the environment's a little bit off, humans are going to solve it, So there's really no need for action around some of these things. It's business as normal. So I definitely know people in my life that feel that way, and they're not taking any action around these themes. On the other hand, I know people that are almost the opposite, but they're still over on this quadrant of my pendulum of awareness. They're people that are highly aware, that things are changing and, feel like a deep fear inside of them. But for whatever reason, they're not actually able to do anything to address it, and maybe that's because they're paralyzed by fear and they just can't think about it. Maybe it's because they just don't know where to start or they're overwhelmed. Maybe it's just very realistic, a capacity thing, for whatever reason in their life, they're just swimming to get by. And the thought of addressing these bigger issues isn't really realistic for them right now, which is very, very legit. I have all the compassion in the world for that. But there's kind of our one end of the spectrum, knowing things are changing, not taking action. The other end of it is people that are taking action, but they're driven by fear, driven by panic, driven by anxiety. And I intentionally use the word may here, but when we're driven by the fear, the panic, the anxiety, it can result in an unhealthy relationship with those changes and those challenges that are potentially coming. So what I'd kind of like to propose tonight is, reframing our perspective around change and challenge to land somewhere in this middle, which is this theme of tonight, this becoming naturally resilient. And I thought I would just share a couple of things that I have found have really helped me do that. I'm somebody that's actually, I didn't talk a lot about my background. Actually, maybe I will do this really, really quickly right now. I'm going to pull the screen back up because it's kind of relevant to this point I'm making right now. But my background, really, really quick in a nutshell, I started out learning about permaculture, studying actually under Starhawk a little bit, who is part of Earth Activist Training, who's Charles is representing here tonight, and learning about growing food. Became really obsessed with growing food. And then I got really into nature and wilderness skills for a number of years. And kind of long story short, I hit this place where I realized that both nature was threatened and our food systems were threatened. And it got me, along with a lot of other systems like infrastructure. And I started thinking a lot about emergency preparedness. And I actually went back to school. I studied emergency preparedness from a Western lens. And I even started working in consulting for a very large firm. So I've worked with like hospitals, I've worked with governments of all different sizes, I've worked with private organizations and groups consulting in our emergency planning for the future. But when I was looking at the modern lens from emergency preparedness, I felt like there was some big holes as far as bridging this with other parts of kind of my background and my understanding. And I've kind of framed this into this methodology perspective, I'll say, called holistic emergency preparedness, where we think about the best tools of kind of modern Western emergency preparedness, but then we're actually bridging that with deep knowledge of ecology and deep knowledge of place, bridging it with things like permaculture and sustainable design, and then also making sure we bring the community piece in and tending relationships in healthy ways. And I try to kind of bridge all of those into my perspective on emergency preparedness and kind of adapting to a changing times, adapting to our changing world. So in thinking about, what's helped me shift my perspective, I've had people come up to me multiple times and be like, Chris, I don't know how you can work in emergency preparedness and constantly be thinking about disasters. Like I wouldn't be able to sleep at night if I was thinking about disasters all the time. You're always thinking about worst case scenarios. How come your anxiety is not through the roof? And I actually consider myself a very optimistic and generally a very calm person, even though I spend a lot of time looking at worst case scenarios. So I wanted to just share a couple of thoughts around the mindset piece, and then we're going to dive into more of the physical pieces, which is like, what what am I actually concerned about with hazards right now in the world, challenges, changes? And then what are some of the things I'm thinking about as far as adapting to it? So that's where we're going to go with this conversation. But the mindset is foundational for me, right? Once our mind starts to go, everything else goes. So supporting that mindset is huge. And for me, a big part of that is actually the story that I choose to tell, which then becomes my perspective around change. I'm going to just take a breath there, have a sip of water. I get talking fast, everyone. So if I'm talking too fast, if you're on the screen there, just be slow down, Chris. Take a breath. So naturally resilient. We see a lot of things. A lot of times we can look at these things and think of them as challenging, as scary. But we can also look at the hope and the opportunity in there as well. And to me, being naturally resilient is being able to look at both of those things at the same time. And probably the two most powerful things that have been supported me in being able to actually hold both of those realities at the same time. Like, hey, there's some actual really scary things out there. They're actually changing really fast. They are going to impact me in lifetime. And I actually can sleep really well at night. And I actually feel very hopeful about the future and very optimistic. And I feel inspired. One of them is actually observing the natural world deeply, really, really cultivating our relationship with the land. Nature has extreme beauty, but it actually has a lot of harshness. And, through COVID times and even through recent times, when I think about what's going on with war right now, when I think about social unrest, I'm amazed how many lessons there are out in nature if you truly spend large amount of time sitting and observing. I think about behind my house right now. It's actually a really interesting one. I've been living in this place for 13 years, and we've always had beavers kind of in this little pond behind us. But for whatever reason, in the last year, this group of beavers that have come in that are having a major, major impact on the land that I haven't seen in 13 years. They basically raised the water level by over a meter, and it's completely changing the shoreline. We now have hundreds of trees that are dying. And with that, you actually have the displacement of all kinds of other wildlife. And it's interesting because I do watch the land very intently. There's individual bird families that I know from year to year. Like I actually know which tree they're going to come back and nest in or what area they'll be in each year. And I've been tracking them literally for a decade now. The same bird coming back to the same tree. And when that bird doesn't make it, sometimes it's offspring coming back to that same area, right? And you could say, cool, so this area floods and now that bird habitat isn't there anymore. Well, the bird is now flying from migration to the south to come and land here next spring, and its home isn't there anymore. It's not that much different than a person returning after a wildfire to find out that their home isn't actually there anymore. That happens in nature too. And you might think for a bird, well, it's no big deal for a bird, they just fly to the next tree over or fly to that next piece of land. But it's actually not that simple either. There was a reason that bird picked that exact tree. Birds don't just pick random trees to nest in, right? And if you start to really understand and think about a bird's life 365 days a year, what are a bird's needs throughout all of the seasons, throughout the times of day? They're actually very complex, quite like people. And when they pick a tree to nest in, they're picking a very specific tree for a very specific reason, especially if it's used year after year, generation after generation. That might have been the best, safest home to raise their family in their whole territory that they picked. And now it's gone because of these beavers changing the landscape. And that bird now has to adapt. And they may fly inland in the forest now to go find a new place, and they actually get kicked out by another bird. Nature can actually be harsh sometimes. In the springtime, the birds can straight up be violent with each other in the defense of their territory, right? So I say all of that just to speak to, the metaphors that come up when we really get to thinking about, how wildlife's lives look 365 days a year. And when we really observe those cycles, there's so many metaphors for us, we see harshness out there. There's extreme beauty in the natural world, but there's also a lot of sadness, there's also a lot of harshness. And in seeing kind of what I like to think of as like natural law or the natural ways, and being able to watch it play out in the natural world, it's actually really helped me immensely in being able to look at, a similar metaphor of it playing out in our human world. And it gives me a framework to actually digest it and sit with it. you know, and reconcile it within my own mind. So that's the first thing I just want to share there, you know, and beyond the metaphors I speak to, you know, there's just this power in going out into nature and cultivating that relationship that actually, you know, the number of times I've had a complex problem that I'm really stressed about, and I go and I just sit in nature for like, you know, sometimes it's 20 minutes, sometimes it's hours. You know, when was the last time you sat in the same spot for 3 hours or more, just observing, and you weren't looking at your phone and you weren't listening to music, and you were actually trying not to even listen to your thoughts. You were actually listening to nature, like truly listening to nature. When was the last time you did that for a long period of time? It's amazing the wisdom and the perspective and the insights that come through when you do that. And when you bring a problem to that, I shouldn't say when I've brought a problem to that in the past, I've been blown away sometimes by the answers I've gotten to my problems, like out of nowhere, you know? Um, it's a really powerful force there. Beyond that, we know that nature is incredibly resilient. It's been through so much over the long-term history. Nature can teach us about resilient design. We don't have time to dive into tonight, but there's this whole sector of science called biomimicry, where people are literally solving some of the most complex challenges of our time by looking for places where nature has a similar-ish problem and how did nature solve it, and then trying to apply it to human technology and human systems. Just make a mental note to yourself. Biomimicry is what it's called. If you just put it into YouTube after this call, you'll see all kinds of cool videos of like mind-blowing discoveries people have made or solutions they've come up with just based on observing patterns in nature. So that's the first one I wanted to share there around the shifting mindset, you know, just really cultivating that deep relationship with the land. I'm actually going to even pause here for a second right now. I'm going to invite you to take a moment right now, maybe even close your eyes if you feel comfortable doing that, just for a moment right now. And I just want you to take one moment to contemplate your relationship with the natural world and what needs to be tended there right now for you. Don't let what I've said influence that at all. Just in your heart right now, when you think about your relationship with the natural world, what would you like to tend right now? What would you like to feed or grow in that relationship? And if something comes to you and you feel called, I invite you to share it in the chat. If you don't feel called to share, don't worry about it. That's fine too. And if nothing came to you, you know, maybe that's a cool question to actually bring to the forest. Or if you live in the city, bring to the tree or your front lawn, or maybe even just your balcony, you know, and just sit with that question, you know, what do I want to tend in my relationship right now that would be supportive to you living your vision and living your work in this world? The next part I wanted to share on the perspective, one that I found really valuable for me, is actually shifting. It's completely shifted my understanding on disaster and challenge. And that's really looking at both natural history, but I mean like over like a long period. You know, when we look over hundreds of years into thousands of years, into tens of thousands of years in natural history, and then doing the same with human history as well. When I look at everything through the context of my life, everything feels so like crazy and overwhelming. But when I look at it through the context of hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of years, we start to see patterns. And Charles is going to speak a little bit to this at the end of it. You know, I think the way I want to sum it up on the natural part is, you know, when we start really studying history, this earth has been through so much already, you know, long before we had carbon. And this is not at all a challenge to humans' carbon footprint and the impact. You know, I absolutely believe humans are having an impact on climate change, but climate change did exist long before humans started creating carbon. Climate change sometimes has been very fast. Sometimes it's been very, very slow in natural history, right? We've had major ice ages. We've had major droughts that have caused major famines, right? These things have actually been happening for tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. Really, the climate has always been changing in some degree. And humans and the ecosystems on this earth have actually evolved alongside with the challenge. And for whatever reason, for me, you know, just knowing that actually feels empowering to me. You know, you could look at that as being scary, like the fact that there's always been change and struggle and things changing, or that could actually inspire you to think, wow, we're actually designed to adapt, to change. You know, it's like in our DNA, it's in our ancestry to adapt and to change over time. and it is in the ecology of the earth and the ecosystems as well. So that actually gives me a little bit of faith. It actually, in some ways, for me, it alleviates some of the weight of changing times. And I want to be careful saying that, because I don't want it to I don't want to say it in a way that it exonerates me of my responsibility in being a good steward of the land. I don't want to use it as an excuse not to be good on the environment. But it does actually help take a little bit of weight off me when I think about, how much things have actually changed throughout time and history, and how humans have adapted alongside of that. So, on that second note, what I'd like to share, or what I'd like to ask you to do, I'll get you to close your eyes for one more moment right now. And knowing that you come from a long ancestry that is resilient, that is adaptable, what in you is resilient? What in you is adaptable? What strong traits do you bring forward into this modern world, in this modern times? And just sit with that question for a moment right now. Absolutely every single person on this call brings strength into this world, regardless of what your situation is. If you'd like to share in the chat, feel free to do that. You don't need to as well. And again, if you weren't unsure, then that's kind of a cool question to sit with as well. It could even be a cool question to ask someone. I've found before, it can sometimes be hard to give ourselves praise. So sometimes if I'm struggling with something, and I'm feeling kind of down on myself, I'll go and ask someone that knows me well and say, hey, what strengths do you see in me? How do you think I'm resilient and adaptable? And it can be a really powerful exercise when you're feeling a little bit down, when you're feeling intimidated by what's ahead of us. So I'm going to leave this first piece kind of there, just with this, this encouragement to really think about deepening your relationship with the land in a powerful way. And this is more than just going for casual walks in the woods, really learning to observe the natural cycles, really learning about what does it look like for an animal of your ecosystem to live out there 24/7, learning the traits of the trees, so that one. And then the second one, really thinking about long-term history of humans and ecology as two great tools for shifting perspectives and empowering perspectives in changing time. So I'll leave it there, and we're going to kind of transition into kind of part 2 of my talk tonight. I'm going to pull up another slide here, so just give me a half second. And I'll just mention, I apologize, I'm not actually looking at the chat right now. I'll look at the chat when Charles is talking, but if you're sharing questions or comments for me, I may not see them right now. Okay, so let's get into a little bit more specifics right here. So another tool that I found really, really helpful when it comes to the practical side of adaptation, in trying to build a more resilient and prepared lifestyle, I really like frameworks that actually help us take overwhelming topics and break them down into really simple actions and really clear pathways forward. And for me, when I have a lot of conversations with people around kind of the challenges of our time, and probably one of the most common things I hear from people is they're just like, this topic is so big and I'm just completely overwhelmed by it that I'm frozen in it and I don't know what to do. Or I feel like everything I'm doing is too small and not enough. That's a very, very common thing that I hear. So I like to look at, what is the tool set? What is the framework that allows us to kind of make sense of the enormity of it and the massive amount of possibilities and informations and challenges and hazards, and break them down into very tangible next steps that feel realistic for me with my actual situation. And my actual situation is going to be completely different than every other person on this call tonight. So one of the tools, and I'm not going to get into this tool specifically tonight, you can kind of actually ignore the numbers. Those don't really actually mean a whole lot. I actually created those for another class. But one of the tools that I learned about in my study of modern emergency management, and it's pretty foundational in creating emergency plans. So when I've worked with a municipality, for example, to actually make an emergency plan, the first thing we actually do is we basically brainstorm, well, what are all the possible hazards your municipality could face? I would do the same thing if I worked with a business. Okay, you have a business, you want your business to be more resilient. What are all of the things that could impact your business in a negative way? You can also do this with your family, your household, right? What are all the things? And we map it out. And the list starts off kind of overwhelming. But then we are going to take this permaculture principle, and it's called from designing from patterns into details. And we're actually going to kind of bring this down into a very realistic plan set. So when I start to do kind of my current like big picture HIRA of the world, these are some of the things that are on the top of my mind these days. And, this is relative to, my perspective. This is relevant to where I live in the world. It's relative to my life situation. So yours might be a little bit different than this. But these are some of my top concerns right now. The changing of the climate and extreme weather is very much at the top of the list. Oh, and I should say these aren't necessarily in priority sequence. These are just, 4 things that are very much on my mind these days. Climate change and extreme weather, definitely something that's on my mind. I've been thinking a lot about infrastructure lately, and really COVID, I was thinking about this before COVID, but COVID really drove it home for me. Fragile, aging, and unsustainable infrastructure. It was amazing how quickly we weren't able to get certain things, during that pandemic that we had there. When I think about fragile, aging, unsustainable infrastructure, I think about our medical system. I've felt very fortunate to live in Canada for most of my life, and I still do, for a lot of reasons. With our medical system, there's some amazing things about our medical system. But if any of you guys watched the Resilient Future series that we did last winter with Earth Activist Training, and we had Dr. Noman Nahim on, a really good friend of mine who actually works in the system, and he talked a lot on that call about, some of the problems we saw come up in COVID with capacity and stuff weren't necessarily caused by COVID. They've actually been building for a long time. And that a lot of our infrastructure, although it's maybe been really strong in some ways, also has some really big holes in it really quickly. We're seeing major shortages right now in our medical system of staffing. There's, I could really go down a rabbit hole there, but medical infrastructure is something that's a concern of mine, as well as the evolution of bacteria and funguses, antibiotic resistance, funguses that are becoming resistant to antibiotics and agents that would have traditionally killed them. Our food systems, that's a huge worry. I mean, we saw this big in COVID, we also see the impact of this from fires and droughts impacting food, which whether it's impacting access to food or it's impacting cost of food, geopolitics is impacting equability in food and who has access and who doesn't. So those are all things there. Supply chains, cyber infrastructure. I think about how reliant a lot of our critical infrastructure is on the internet, and that there are a number of things that could potentially take that down short term or even longer term. That's all very real. The last 2 I'll name there, the global economy and the debt load is something that's very much on my mind. I used to come from this perspective like, who cares about the economy? It's unsustainable in the first place. But as I get older, I also realize that, when people are struggling financially, that has a direct impact on their well-being. And it has a direct impact on whether they're going to actually work towards, improving social situations. How much capacity and energy do you have to be a good steward of the land, right? Is often, I shouldn't say it's always, but there can be a correlation between how well somebody is feeling. Are their needs being met? Shelter, water, fire, food. Are they stressed about money, or did they have those things coming in? May influence your capacity to actually tend the land away around you in a good way, to tend other relationships in a good way, to contribute to the world, and have the capacity to take on a social justice cause or an environmental cause could be very much impacted by how you're feeling economically. So there is an impact to that. And I've got some big concerns about kind of where the world's at with debt load right now. The last one there, I'm sure a lot of you are feeling this right now, is this geopolitical situation that the world's in right now and has been growing for some time. There's some major shifts happening, when it comes to geopolitical power on a global scale. And, the fallout from that is some of the social unrest that we're seeing, we're seeing more of it here in Canada than we have in a really long time. It's a little bit intimidating, Another one I throw in there is demographic changes. And when I'm talking about demographics, I'm actually thinking about even age structure of the working population across the world and how that relates to all of our infrastructure needs being met, the design of our world. So these are all very, very real things that are happening around, in my mind anyways. And you may have other ones that you put on this list. This isn't an all-inclusive list. These are just some of the things that I'm really thinking about. So I'm going to just take a quick breath right now because that's a lot. That can feel heavy when you start thinking about that. So how do we start to turn that from an overwhelming catastrophe into actually feeling empowered? Like, okay, no, we can actually do something that impacts all of these, at least on some level, on a local level for sure. Maybe some of it on a larger level. So one tool that I learned when I was doing my modern emergency management is just this idea of starting to map the ripple effect of an event and how it carries across the landscape, across the ecosystem. You could do this activity for your personal family. You could do this activity for your community. You could do this activity for the business. You could come at this activity from so many different angles. And what angle you come at it might actually impact what's on there. But let's just take that first one, identified climate change and extreme weather as something that I'm concerned about. So when I start to think, well, what is the actual ripple effect of those things? Well, one thing, it's actually shifting weather patterns. Another thing is it's making a change in species diversity. We're really noticing where I live that this is impacting insect populations. It's impacting trees. The number of diseases that we actually are starting to see in trees that are popping up really quickly right here, which of course has a ripple effect into wildlife populations, which, ripples into everything else, right? So two ripples that come out: weather patterns, species diversity. I could list a whole bunch more on there. Now I'm going to kind of break those down a little bit more. So I'm going to look at the weather patterns here. Well, what are weather patterns going to impact? And I'm kind of doing this for my life right now. As I said, I could do this for my community. I could do this for the environment. I could do this for my business or organization. I'm doing it for my life. So when I think, well, how are these weather patterns going to impact my life? Well, one, they're going to impact my garden because I grow food. Two, they're going to impact the food that I buy. It's affecting the price of food. It's also affecting the availability of food, or has the potential to. Weather patterns can impact the infrastructure that I rely on: water, electricity, communications. Weather patterns may actually bring, floods. It may bring drought. It may bring fire. It may bring extreme winds. Those are things that start to ripple out from there. If I go down to species diversity, well, it impacts species diversity. Well, how so? It impacts trees, it impacts mammals, it impacts amphibians. I keep kind of working my way out. So this next tool that I look at here, so now we're going to basically take one of these. So I'm picking infrastructure right now. So we've gone climate change, weather patterns, infrastructure. Now I'm going to take infrastructure and I'm going to break it down. And this is basically starting really big. And we're going to take this down into small, actionable items that can actually have results, positive results, in the short term and the long run. So when I think about the weather patterns and the infrastructure, I want to think about what critical infrastructure does my life actually rely on, or is very supportive in my life. One big part is our garden. A lot of our food comes from our garden. Another part is, like, I need water to live. My water comes out of a tap in my house. That tap comes from a well system. That well system is reliant on the next one, which is electricity. If the electricity stops coming to my house for whatever reason, whether it's for an hour or 24 hours or a week or a month, if the electricity stops, the water stops. If the water stops, I can't water my garden, right? Communications is a big one. I think about, as much as I hate to admit it, I'm very reliant on my phone. My parents don't live in the same town as me. I need this to make sure that they're doing okay. My wife and I aren't together all the time, so we talk to each other. In the event of an emergency, if I don't have this phone to communicate with my loved ones, what the heck do I do? What if we're separated and there is no phone to call each other? Whether this is short term and it's going to be back tomorrow, or this is down for a week, or it's down for a month, right? So I could keep doing this, but this is a powerful exercise, for yourself, is just to identify, well, what is the critical infrastructure that you rely on that really support your health and your well-being of yourself, your family, your farm, your organization or business? Now, this is the fun part for me. And this is where I start to apply the permaculture mindset to this. And, for those of you that have studied the principles of permaculture, one of the principles we use is this idea of designing from patterns into details. So I want to start looking for patterns. And once I start to have patterns, I can actually design details that make them more resilient, that make them less fragile to some of the concerns in the first place. So for example, now when I look at the garden, and I've combined garden and food now for this one. So when I look at garden and food, well, one pattern I see is water. I need water to water my garden. Water needs electricity. or to run, or it needs rain to come from the land. A drought could potentially impact. So I'm starting to find this pattern in food around its need for water. So we literally did this during COVID. My wife and I kind of went through this process of our critical infrastructure. We identified water and we started thinking, okay, well, how do we actually become more resilient and less fragile when it comes to our dependency on water? So, one thing we realized is like, okay, well, we've actually always grown vegetables that we like to eat. That's our first focus. What do we like to eat? And we'll plant that in our garden. And we started thinking, what if we made sure that a percentage of our garden, even a small percentage, is actually in drought resilient crops? So that if a bunch of our crops die because we can't water them, because we're in a drought, there's some food that's still going to come out even in a drought. And we started planting each year some very drought resilient crops. We also started planting crops that are actually able to take an excess of water and still do well and still flourish. It's not all of our food, but we've actually thought about drought and excess moisture in what seeds we're choosing to sow on our land. We also put in rain barrels. So now if the power goes out, so if I lose electricity, well, my first layer is, okay, I've got rain barrels. So watering my garden and giving water to our animals. We actually raise chickens and we raise rabbits on our homestead. So the rain barrels is my first layer. My system of rainwater is not going to last super long though. So what I can do though is actually get a generator, and we literally just bought a generator. My first layer is to use the rain barrels, and my second layer is to use the generator to fill up the rain barrels and pump that water. Now the generator is only going to last for a few days. Hopefully the disaster doesn't last more than a few days. But I've got layer 1 rain barrel, layer 2 water pump, layer 3. I haven't got this one, but I've actually sourced one, and I'm basically saving up to get it right now. I'm also searching old antique stores and farm stores. Is an actual hand water pump, because we actually have a dug well on our property, and it happens to be in a good location where it's unlikely to go dry. So my third layer is to actually install a hand pump. So I literally could hand pump water up. But there's so many other things you could do about water depending on your situation. I know in some of the dry climates, the American Southwest, out in California, people work with these concepts called swales on the landscape, where they're literally digging kind of like drainage ditches that actually pool some of that water lower in the surface. And when there is rain, it slows down how fast the water moves across the landscape. So more of it absorbs into the soil. And then thus the soil stores that water for longer. It also brings you closer to the water table in certain areas. So you're basically creating more water storage in the natural soil. So there's a design thing you could do if drought's one of your things. Another one that we've done here, there's a wetland near our house, and the wetland is actually spring fed. So we've actually been planting perennial crops in the wetland, because even in a drought, this wetland is unlikely to go dry because it's spring fed. We have pretty strong aquifers here, at least at this time in human history. So, this is quite a comprehensive list here, but really all I'm doing is trying to get your brain kind of spinning around how can we go from this kind of overwhelming concept of, oh my goodness, climate change and extreme weather, what do I do? To, okay, well, how is that going to impact me? Well, it's going to impact the weather. Then looking at my critical infrastructure, well, these are the different things that the weather could do. And then I'm going to get specific and micro about that piece of infrastructure and say, okay, well, what infrastructure do I rely on? What can I start to do to help that infrastructure, right? I'm going to give you one more example here, and then hopefully I'm going to share something that makes this even less overwhelming if it still feels like a lot of work and overwhelming. And then I'm going to pass it over to Charles shortly here. So give you another example here. So food storage was another thing that we identified. We're quite busy people, and we tend to, our vegetables, get stored in the root cellar. We can a little bit of tomato sauce, but a lot of our meat that we have, and even a lot of our vegetables, we actually freeze because it's really convenient for us. And we started thinking, wow, that freezer meat is very convenient for our current lifestyle to be able to freeze it. It's also not very energy efficient. And it's completely reliant on electricity. So knowing that our lives are continue to be busy, we're still going to keep putting stuff in the freezer. But what we've done, because we've identified electricity as our critical infrastructure and that freezer meat is something important to us, we've actually put some systems in place that would allow us to adapt if that electricity gets taken away. So the first one is we've now bought this generator. And we're starting to design from that pattern into the details. We bought a generator. The generator we need to have is now reliant on us being able to store gas. We're probably not storing gas for more than, maybe 4 days, maybe a week to run that generator. But at least I know that I can keep that generator going, and I'm not going to lose our crops from our vegetable, over that 4 to 7 day period. Now, what if I have a concern that this emergency situation is actually going to go longer than a week? Well, we've actually purchased a dehydrator. So I could literally, while that generator is running over the course of the 4 days, I can also be slowly taking some of that meat out, slicing it up into jerky, and I could be dehydrating it. So I could be using the electric one. I could be using solar one. I could also be doing it over a fire. So we actually have the ability to use the generator to buy us time if we're worried about a longer situation while we dehydrate that meat. The other thing we are invested in is a pressure canner. So we're trying to actually pressure can more meat right off the bat in the season, so it doesn't end up in the freezer in the first place, and it has a long shelf life. But while the dehydrator is running, we could also be pressure canning. Now, what do we need to run that pressure canner? Well, we need recipes. We probably need salt. We need extra canning jars. There's also natural preserving methods. So again, this isn't necessarily the answers for you. It's just an example of a process where I say, okay, garden and food is critical infrastructure. Food storage is a bit of a liability, especially my freezer meat because of the electricity. What are actionable steps I could take to start working on that? So take a breath right now, because I know that still feels like a lot of work, especially if you have a lot to do. But here's the positive piece. A diverse climax forest grows slowly and consistently over time. And I want you to think about your own life and your own resiliency in that same context. A diverse climax forest grows slowly and consistently over time. Baby steps really do add up over time, especially if you're able to pick the most high leverage steps early on when you're thinking about these design systems. So here's another question for you to contemplate a little bit. If you were to think about some of the infrastructure that you really rely on for your family's well-being, your farm's ability to run, maybe your business ability to operate, what are the high levered actions you could take that would actually impact multiple hazards or multiple system needs at the same time? Because sometimes there's one thing you can do. Like if I get into the nitty gritty of like, okay, well, I'm just thinking about my freezer system and I'm going to go and build a dehydrator to dehydrate meat if my freezer goes down. Like that's a lot of effort, and it only really solves or addresses one thing I'm concerned about. Meanwhile, I have this other big list. My generator actually, on the other hand, wow, the generator actually solves a whole bunch of problems. It allows me to keep that meat frozen longer. It allows me to run the dehydrator. It allows me to keep the water coming up. It allows me to charge devices. That's a very high leverage action. Now, of course, that takes some financial capacity to have the generator. But if the financial capacity isn't there, just get creative with what other capacities you can create, what other systems would actually be high leverage and impact multiple things at once. What I'm going to suggest right now is, oh, did I go there? Yeah, to you is community mapping. One thing that forests have going for them is that they're diverse. And the more diverse a forest is, the more adaptable it is to extreme weather, the more adaptable it is to climate change. So for myself, thinking about, I only can do so much. I only have so many resources. I only have so much capacity. But with my community around me, we have a lot of skills. We have a lot of capacity. And I'm sure all of you have families and friends and you know a little bit about them. But here's a question for you. When was the last time you really thought about your network of people and your community in an intentional way and put it in context to the changing world that we're in? Put it in context to climate change. Put it in context to world challenges and struggles. And maybe something you want to consider doing is actually getting together with a group of friends, doing an activity like we talked about right now, where you kind of identify hazards, identify some of the challenges, and then actually say, okay, well, who feels like they have capacity? Just like you shared in the chat, well, I'm really good at this. I'm really good at that. Have you ever done that intentionally with a group of people to say, so that if something happened and the infrastructure got taken out, we actually know as a community who could help with different aspects. And because we talked about it ahead of time, we can actually access that relatively quickly. We can also identify things that our community is maybe missing. And like, wow, within our community, we really don't have this covered. Well, there's a high leverage action because, I don't have to grow all the food. I live in an apartment. I can't grow a lot of food, but, this person over here can. What can I bring to it? Well, we're missing this skill set, whatever it is. A high leverage action would be me to go learn that skill set for the community. And it's part of this community map that we put together. So there's just something to consider as far as a high leverage potential action. I do this fun, when I've done exercises with groups before, I've actually gone into communities and run this emergency preparedness workshop and becoming resilient workshop. And we'll play a community bingo game. Those games where you walk around and you have to get someone to sign off on the different things. And usually they're like silly things like who's been to Disneyland and who's, whatever, who knows how to juggle. So what I basically did is I made a sheet and I listed skill sets that would be really valuable in a challenging situation. Things like an amateur radio license, things like first aid or advanced medical training, experience in fire suppression, experience looking after youth, experience looking after the elderly. There's so many different skills. And what we actually do at the community event, so you can literally throw a potluck with your neighborhood and invite your friends over for a potluck and say, hey, I've got a fun activity to get to know each other a little bit. I'm going to give each of you the sheet. I want you to walk around the room and find somebody that has this skill set. And it becomes a fun icebreaker. You get to know your neighbors better, but you're actually mapping the assets within your community. And it's interesting food for thought to say, okay, well, how could we actually improve our capacity as a community? You could do this with a workplace as well. And you could make these things, if you work for a larger organization, a not-for-profit, an eco-village, a farm, a for-profit business, you can think about, what does our business need to function in a disaster and what pieces, make a map like this and play this game with your staff as part of staff training, as a way to really think about your capacity and your map and the way that you come together. I'd like to share one more example really quick. And then just to cue you, Charles, I'm going to pass it over to you after this one. So just so you're ready to go there. So another example, I just gave you an example there. I listed all these hazards if I go back to my list here. And I just started to break down the process I'm using around climate change and extreme weather. I'm going to give you another example around the economy and the debt load really quick. Just again, to kind of help you take what I did with disasters, but apply it to something that might feel totally different. Because you might think, well, how does your kind of map here with weather patterns in your garden, how does that apply to my business or my organization and the economy or my personal finances in the economy? So when I come over to this example, well, where is it down here? So I have a lot of concerns about the economy, where it is short term and some concerns longer term. The longer term concerns are different than the short term ones. And my wife and I, we run a business. It's called Wild Muskoka. We actually make sustainably wild forage food products that we then sell, take to market. We sell direct to consumers online and we sell to some stores. And we actually started this process basically right at the beginning of COVID. And it was so valuable because our business faced many challenges during COVID and we actually did pretty well. So what we basically did is we did that HIRA, that hazard identification risk assessment for the business. What are the risks to the business? What critical infrastructure does the business rely on? You could do this with your personal finances. Our family household's income. What are the risks to our family's personal income and its impact on our livelihood? So, we identified a recession as a challenge. We also identified supply chain issues. So when we continue this ripple effect out, well, what happens if we have a recession? Well, people spend less money. So how are we going to prepare for the possibility of people spending less money? Well, one, if we have more customers, even if an individual person is spending less money or some customers drop off and can't buy anymore, if there's more kind of customers to pool from, hopefully that keeps us at least at a baseline, So maybe our income is staying the same, but our customer pool is growing. Another one we thought about, a lot of our products are actually kind of luxury products, maybe luxury is not the right word. I feel like, eating foraged foods feeds people's souls in a deep way. I like to feel that and think that. But, when things get tough, people maybe aren't buying our fancy infused organic apple cider vinegar or, our wild leek infused wild salt. It's just not a priority in tough financial times. So we identified a lot of our product line, people might stop buying if things got challenging. And we started thinking about, well, what are products that are actual needs for people, not wants? And we've actually been doubling down on our one kind of medicinal product, which is our elderberry syrup that keeps people healthy. With the hypothesis, that during challenging times, a lot of people are probably going to stop buying our main line, but they may still buy the elderberry syrup because it supports their health. They may personally consider that more of a need than a want, or something more desirable than salt. The benefit of spending the money for them is more worthwhile. So you can think about your business plan, and it's like, hey, which of our products would actually be most affected if people stop spending money? Is there a service or product that's still very relevant? And to think about that a little bit ahead of time so that it's actually ready to go if you need it is really important. I'll jump down to the supply chain issue one right there really quick. So we thought about local supply chain issues. The first thing we thought about is, okay, we got to make sure there's enough stores locally carrying our stuff that if we can't get our product out of our bioregion, we still have a local market. So that's one thing that makes us more resilient. We also want backup suppliers, and this was huge in COVID. We did a bunch of research ahead of time, and sure enough, a couple of our main suppliers stopped supplying or weren't able to get things that we relied on for our business. If we hadn't thought about this ahead of time, it would have been a massive financial hit. Potentially, it would have bankrupted the business. But because we did that research ahead of time, we already had backup suppliers lined up for things that we required. We also started holding extra inventory of things we knew that were absolutely critical to the business keeping going. So exact same model I use for my garden and climate change and extreme weather now applied to the economy and a business. So I'm going to pass it over to Charles here in a minute. I know we could dive into any one of these topics. Any one of these topics could be a course in itself. There's so many solutions. There's so many possibilities. There's so many variables. What I hope you're getting out of this is that there is a process that we can start to use to take it from something that's pretty intimidating and overwhelming and bring it down to very actionable steps that actually make sense. Remember that high leverage action piece is one of the big takeaways from my talk tonight. The other one, remember cultivating that relationship with the land and being able to actually go to nature to look for models of resiliency as one of the big takeaways for the land, as well as it being able to support you when you feel stressed and overwhelmed and help you find perspective. So I hope those are some of the big takeaways from tonight. I'm going to share a little bit about a couple courses I'm running to help you actually go deeper on both those, the nature connection awareness piece and the preparedness piece. But I'm going to let Charles share a couple of things first, and I'll come back to that. So over to you, Charles.
Hello, everybody. Before we jump into the next piece where I want to talk about the ecology of disaster, and Chris had mentioned analogs, like how do we look at analogs in the natural world? I want to talk a little bit about, I just want to share with you some of the things that are coming up, both with Earth Activist training, and Chris can talk about Chris Outdoors, some of the other learning opportunities. If you're interested in this and want to know more about what you can do, or here are some of the options that are coming up. So. There we go. So Earth Activist training teaches permaculture. We have a bunch of basic permaculture courses. We have an advanced permaculture course coming up starting in February. If you're interested, it's a 4-part program. So you can either take the parts individually. We have one on forests and some on water, on soil and animals, and on site design. And this really talks through how do we create regenerative landscapes. So if you're interested in that, check us out, earthactivisttraining.org. I'm going to put in the chat some of the links. The other things that are coming up right away, we have a few classes coming up that you might be interested in. We have a regenerative business design class. This is a class that looks at how do we use ecological design and regenerative understandings to create our businesses and manage our businesses. So if you're interested in that or have a business or want to start one, this is a great place to go. We have an intro to GIS mapping. So people who do design and want to learn more about mapping, we have that. And Chris is going to be teaching a class called Creating Community Resilience, Fire, Flood, Drought, and Heat. And he can talk a little more about that. So you'll notice in the chat, I've put links to a few of the classes coming up for Earth Activist training. Both the GIS class and Chris's class have a discount code for those who are on tonight. So take a look at that. Go ahead and register. It'll be 20% off if you use the code that's in the chat. So Chris, I'm going to pass it back over to you, and you can talk a little about what you're doing, and then we'll move on.
Awesome. I'm going to just ask folks to maybe not comment in the chat just for a couple of minutes there, just so if anyone wants to check out the links that Charles just shared, that they're kind of at the bottom and everyone can find them. So if we can just pause on chatting for just a moment right here. Yeah, so I just wanted to touch on a couple things quick here as well. Kind of the whole theme of tonight's call, all of these topics that we're diving into, they've had a huge influence on my life, and they're very much interwoven into all of my offerings. I don't often, talk about hazards and climate change and disasters in my day-to-day work. A lot of my work is around helping people deepen their relationship with the land, develop skills, homesteading, permaculture, all those kinds of things. But to me, they're all so connected and they're so interwoven, and a lot of these challenges, they can be addressed so naturally without actually having to name the scary things, without having to name the challenges, just developing skills, developing knowledge, and developing community naturally makes us so much more adaptable to these different situations. So if you're kind of feeling drawn to the approach that I've been sharing tonight, I know I was actually skimming the chat. There's some beautiful things happening in the chat, by the way, folks. Thanks so much for how insightful people, and thanks for being participatory in the chat. While Charles was chatting, I was skimming through there. So if you're feeling drawn to this kind of approach that myself and Earth Activist Training take with all of this stuff, if it makes sense to you and you're wanting to go deeper, I just wanted to mention kind of two things really quick that might be of interest to you. The first one Charles already started to touch on, and it's our Creating Community Resilient course. I'm going to just share my screen for a half second here and just show you the website really quick. Oh, hold on. So this is called Creating Community Resilience, Fire, Flood, Drought, and Heat. It's a 6-week course. We're meeting, it actually starts next week. So it's basically a 2-hour class in the evening. And really, it is designed for you to apply to your family and your home situation. It could be applied to your community, but it could also be applied to your business or your organization. If you work for a business or organization where you think this is relevant, you may even want to see whether they would be willing to sponsor you to come. And we've had people do that in the past before. Because basically what we're going to be doing at this course is we're going to be taking this framework that I just kind of skimmed the surface of tonight, and we're going to be really diving in with a level of depth. We're going to do a bit of time on personal preparedness for your family, but then we're also going to be looking at, applying these models, and you're going to leave the course with a plan where you've kind of mapped out the landscape of concerns, and then you've actually started putting infrastructure in place to help you be more adaptable and respond to that infrastructure. And we're going to really focus on, I saw someone make a comment in the chat, I forget the specifics of it, but they basically said, hey, I work part-time. I only work part-time to begin with. I'm already overwhelmed in that capacity. One of my goals of this course is to actually help us figure out, that idea that a climax forest grows slowly over time. One of my goals of this course is actually to help you figure out, what seed do you plant when you can only plant one seed right now? I feel like I need to plant 20, but I just can't. But if I can only plant one, what seed is realistic for me to plant? And if I can only plant one, which one should I choose first? And which one should I choose second? Because that's part of the goal of this Creating Community Resilience plan, whether it's for your business and organization, your community, or your family, to kind of help you decide what is the pathway forward in small baby steps to start building that resiliency. Starhawk's actually going to be coming on as a guest instructor as part of this course. There's another girl, Lila Darwish, that's coming on. We've got a great team that's going to be coming on. So I'd be thrilled to have you as part of that program. The other one I want to mention right now, and this is on the nature connection side. I talked about that deep nature journey. This one, we're not talking about disasters at all. We're not talking about resiliency. We're literally just having a ton of fun in a supportive community, diving into the gifts of the natural world. So the course is called Reading Nature's Language. This is an online cohort as well. It's starting end of January. And we're basically going to be running calls every other week for 4 months. And there's a whole bunch of pre-recorded stuff. And it's all about helping you basically learn about how do you tell the story of the wildlife written in their tracks, how do you listen to the birds and not just say, hey, that's a robin, but what's the robin actually singing? Is the robin singing about the weather changing? Is the robin singing about a predator on the landscape that it can see or knows about, but you don't? how do I actually interpret those things, you know? It's going to be a deep dive into ecology, and it can be applied to whatever habitat you live in. So if you're interested in having, you know, a community to support you in deepening your relationship with the natural world, you may want to think about checking out the Reading Nature's Language course. Charles put the link down below. And I've got the course on sale right now till January 22nd. So it's basically $100 off for the next 18 days. The link's there. You don't need a coupon code for this one. You can just jump in there. If you have questions about this course or either course, really, feel free to email me. My email is chris@chrisoutdoors.ca. So with that said, I'm going to pass it over to Charles. He's going to take us through kind of part 2, and then we'll do a little bit of question and answer at the end.
Hey, thank you, Chris. So I want to talk about nature and a little bit about how nature works and how we can be inspired to take action. And I'm not going to be in the chat, so if you put something in there, I'll try to catch it when we get to the end, or Chris can respond as he's watching the chat. So I want to think about disasters for a little bit. Like in your life, when you think about disasters that could happen, what are some of the things that would be disasters? You know, we've been talking about natural disasters, and like, what would they be? And just think about what some of them are. And then what would be the hardships? You know, things like wildfire. Right now, I'm out here in Miwok and Pomo country, out here in California, Northern California, and wildfire is a big issue. There's been really intense wildfires, and they're one of the natural disasters everybody talks about and is always worried about. But in the natural system, fire is a part of regeneration. Like, it's not a disaster to a prairie when there's a fire. Like, this is part of a coevolution. This is the thing that we think of as disturbance, as disaster, is only disastrous when it removes something that's critical for existence. But nature has evolved in such a way that it knows these things happen periodically, maybe not all the time. If it happened all the time, it would be very hard. But because there's a period to it that comes and then it goes and it comes back, that is part of the regeneration cycle. You know, it clears out dead grass. It removes, you know, in the case of prairies where I grew up, it removes tree competition. So little trees get started, but they can't weather, you know, a fire, even a low-level fire, and it clears them out and it keeps the grasses. It revitalizes the soil by returning some of the nutrients that fall in the ash back to the soil. So it can do a lot to really support a native ecosystem that has been entrained to that. And the question is, like, how do we create our human systems to be like that? To be like, oh, if there is disturbance, it actually helps regenerate us and isn't such a detriment. And that's the question I'm going to think about tonight. If you come from a lodgepole pine ecosystem, you'll see that fire is important because the cones of the lodgepole are serotinous, which means that they stay closed, they get glued closed, and the heat of the fire and the smoke is what opens them up to release the seeds. They need that to replant themselves. They need that to clear off the understory of hardwoods. And they keep it open in the understory so the seeds can germinate. And help cycle nutrients. So this is an ecosystem that needs fire. So like that thing that we think of as a disaster, wildfires, is actually critical to existence. And anywhere that has evolved with a regular fire cycle, ecologically speaking, will have this regenerative capacity. You can see it in the eastern woodlands. You can see it. There's lots of places that have a fire regime. Sometimes the fire regime is every 3 years. Sometimes it's every 20 years. But that there is a native fire regime, and that is part of regeneration. Like, how do we do that? How do we start to design our cities, our neighborhoods, our communities, so that those things that are right now considered disasters actually become regenerative? How about a flood? I was down doing support in New Orleans. I grew up in the Midwest in the Mississippi River, and it would flood all the time, and it was a disaster for those who lived by it because they built houses in the floodplains. Go figure. But like what in the natural ecosystem, they're important, right? Like especially in the floodplains, like the areas that regularly got floods. This is where nutrients came in. The floodplains are incredibly fertile. And you have these whole complex ecosystems, the willow oak sweet gum groups, or the nuttall oaks and the green ashes, or the overcup oaks and hickories, and they flood in. And as the water came into these areas, that water would bring all the nutrients, but it brought more than just that. It brought in habitat. So when you think about what lives in that water, at the time of the flooding, you get eggs and amphibians, you get a whole host of invertebrates, insect life that comes out of the main channel, and they have part of their life is spent on these floodplains with an abundance of food. So the part of their life cycle requires the floodplain, and without them, you'd lose huge amounts of invertebrates, which means you'd lose huge amounts of birds. Like you'd lose huge amount of pollinators. Like there's all of this that happens because of the floodplains, and without the regular flooding, this thing that is a disaster now for us, it was really the thing that kept everything alive. Like what brought back the life. Like how do we look at this as resource gathering? I remember there was a chunk of my time I was in my life when I was younger. I was working at a retreat center where we regularly got flooded. The campground area, the retreat center would flood because it was in a floodplain. It would flood, and we'd, debris would come in and debris would go out, and we'd gain a few, lawn chairs from up the way, and whatever was left there would get swept out. So we were really careful about what was there, but it also cleared out a lot of debris. It brought in debris, but it also did things like it brought in gravel, as the water was carrying gravel. And if you put up small little like snow fences, you could actually harvest a lot of gravel. The stream would like move it and pile it up, and then you could use it for different projects. So you could think about how to work with the streams. You weren't trying to stop the flood from happening, you're just aware it was going to happen and use that as part of the system because it happened every year or every few years. So how do we engage with the natural systems? Tornadoes or wind. We have these big storms now. I don't know where you are, but I'm currently living in Nova Scotia, the land of the Mi'kmaq. We're getting a lot of hurricanes coming up and storm surges. And I grew up in the Midwest. We had lots of big tornadoes, and they're hard on houses, but in an ecological sense, they're really important. Like having periodic wind, where you have an ecosystem evolved for it, you'd get toppling of trees. You'd get patches of the forest that would open up that were closed and tight. You'd get these openings in the forest. And the opening as it resprouted was where you got food for deer. Like deer weren't chewing the tops of trees that were 30, 40, 50 feet tall. It all had to have growth that was down near the surface. So this regrowth was where you found the deer and you found the quail, and a lot of life happened in these patches. So wind coming through, storm disturbance, reset patches in the forest that would grow up again. And when wind came, another time it might blow down a different patch and it would grow up, and you had this mosaic of moving short and tall forests. It was resetting that succession, right? So it's really important to have these disturbances. When you think about disaster, like how do we create our neighborhoods and communities that disturbance isn't so destructive, but it actually is part of our lives, and we plan for it in a way that invigorates us, right? How can we be more like nature? I'm just going to sit that question out there for a moment and let you think about it. Like, how could we be more like nature? What are some of the characteristics of natural ecosystems that we might want to model? And you feel free to toss some things in the chat as things come up and you think about it. I was enjoying reading the ideas people put into the chat around like, oh, how are you responding to this, ideas that came up? How can you be more like nature? Oftentimes when we talk about disaster, it's not that fire is the disaster. It's not that flooding, like the water, is disaster. It's not that the wind is the disaster, and it's not even the road gets flooded. Like that's not the disaster. The disaster is like you can't get to food, like the grocery store is on the other side, or the power goes out. Like it's not that having a fire that knocks the power out is the fire is not the problem. It's that we're reliant on power to drive our lives. Like, oh, now we can't cook our food or keep our house warm or cold or communicate with our loved ones, or like we're reliant on power, or we can't reach the healthcare system. Like the disaster isn't the event, it's that the event keeps us from accessing something that's important and something that we need or desire, or without it we couldn't continue. So Chris talked a lot about this, like how do you kind of drill down into your particular situation as it is now. Now I want to back off it a little more and say, okay, so if this is true, if the problem really is the lack of access to our critical needs or the things that we're running, like why is our world that way? Like this was a design, like we as humans, not you and I, but or maybe we did, maybe part of our activity we did, but we've designed this world that's fragile because it has long connections between us and what we need. We have extended our needs. So power, where does it come from? Where you come from, where you live, where does your power come from? Does it come from nearby or far away? Is the system of power that is generation and distribution, is it something that you personally or your community can personally engage? Can you produce it? Can you repair it? Do you have the resources to fix it if it was broken? Or does it require something big and beyond you? Like, does it require a large government? Does it require big corporations that you have no direct access to? Like, if you have a system that you have to completely rely on something that is far away, that you have very little input into, maybe it's not very resilient. Because if your community can't maintain it, repair it, build it, re-envision it as your needs change, then you're really beholden to that larger thing that's farther away, right? So how do we re-envision this? Because when you think about a forest, like a forest blows over, burns down, like the seeds come right up there. Like the forest has the resources to rebuild itself right there on site. Like it's not waiting for like some corporation from another continent to come over and reseed it, right? Like it's ready to go, and it has all these allies in the soil, all this fungal and bacterial allies that help it grow up. So it has on-site resource to rebuild itself. The question is, do we have the on-site resources to respond to disturbance? So I'm going to stop this here for a second. Open chat up here, and I just want to chat. I'm going to get rid of this screen spotlighting. We all can see each other. You can turn on your cameras if you want. You can shake yourself if you've been listening here and you kind of like drowsing back or something. Like, what is it in your situation? What is it in your life? Let's have just a little conversation. We got some time here. Not in a hurry. What in your life are some of the ways in which your community could be more resilient? By using some of your local on source. Like this is that community mapping. Like oftentimes in disasters, that you get a disaster happens, and you're like, oh, it was amazing. We all came together and we like did the thing. And like you see these upswells of community involvement as one of the solutions. But like, what can we do before that? Before like it all comes down. So I'm just gonna open up, toss it in chat, or if you want, you can raise your hand and call on you and you can share. A wood bank. Nice, Beth. I believe you're out east right now, but yeah, creating a wood bank. And I'm assuming that's like firewood, that's like wood for heating, or is it wood for building, or is it both?
No, it's wood for heating. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. That's amazing.
It is. It's good.
Yeah.
What a good thing.
I can see a lot of benefits. So you have, wood for, everybody who's part of the wood bank, but also we have those who are in the greatest need, and being able to be able to allocate depending on who has the greatest resource and need. Like maybe not everybody has the same access in where they are. Rainwater harvesting. Awesome, Kaylee. The rainwater harvesting, it's amazing. Rainwater, I'm going to just tangent here for a moment. Water. like getting water to our homes and using it and watering our gardens and drinking and bathing and all that stuff. It's amazing in the industrialized world, in the modern industrialized world, about 30% of all the water that is collected for water use is lost before it gets to our tap. 30%. It's a huge amount of water. That's like we collect all this water and we lose a third of it in dripping pipes and dripping wells and leaky faucets and like bad systems of, you know, municipal systems. Like we lose 30% of it, which is both bad and kind of like we have a water shortage. Is also, I see a hand, Rose, I'll get you in a second. And we have this other thing that takes a huge amount of energy to move water. Like water is heavy and hard to move. And somewhere around 70% of the energy used in the industrialized world is used to move water. Like 70% of like all of Canada's energy use is like moving water, or the US, about 17%. So you like 70% of that and you take 30% and you just like throw it away. If we did better or collected it and used it locally, like that's huge. That's a huge amount of energy that we don't need to like burn coal or nuclear power plants or something. Okay, Rose, go ahead.
Yeah, I was thinking about this, like out where I live, there's a pretty good informal system of kind of mutual support, you know, in our community. It's one of the reasons people really like living here, because people can kind of do their own thing and ignore each other. But if they need something, you know, there's always someone you can call. But it occurs to me that we could be more intentional about that in order to build better infrastructures. I mean, some people are going into solar, but they're still reliant on the power grid, because when the power grid goes out, your solar goes out because it's connected. So what if one person put up a windmill that could supply power for several houses, and it wasn't dependent on, you know, whether or not Nova Scotia Power was cutting down enough trees. But that's another story. So that kind of thing. And the tricky part is that people are very independent here. So how do you get them to get around the table? So
yeah, and that's the question, right? How do you bring people together? And it is core to it. The other part is like community grids, because there are some community grids that have been just that people have created, like small community grids where, you know, the big grid goes down. Often they're tied to the big grid, but the big grid goes down and they isolate the small community grid. Or even in a smaller sense, where somebody, okay, so we have these, you know, local people have local power, but the person who has solar electricity and some batteries, like everybody comes over to their house. Like we're all going to charge our phone at your place because we know, and it's okay. Like, or you have these community centers that say, oh, we're going to have, instead of a generator, like the fossil fuel generator, we have a solar generator. We have both, and people can collect themselves, especially around energy intensive resources. And community sharing is really important for, like, do we all need our same energy intensive resource? Like I know farms that share tractors, you know, like they don't all need a tractor. I know communities that share resources. So how can we both have our community, maybe our community grid, but also maybe we just have a couple of places where people can gather that we know we can, or they're easy to get to, that we're gathering anyway. So like, what are some of the strategies in your community? So but getting people around the table to have that conversation, Rose, I think is, you know, an important part, right?
yeah. But I think it's also, when I've been sort of letting my brain spin on it while you've been talking, I think there are things in place. So the question is, how can you leverage what already works to become, you know, better, bigger, you know, serve more people, or replicatable, or something like that. So
yeah, how do you do it? I see somebody writing here about having a neighborhood email group, as long as the email happens, right? Like once the power goes down, it's hard, you know. The old phone trees. And I know I'm dating myself. I say phone tree, and like some people are like, what are you talking about? But like we used to have these things. We're like, yeah, I'm going to check in with those 3 people. So you always had it interlinked by like 3 or 4. So it isn't just one-to-one, and it isn't one system. They're like, oh, that one system has to work. But like, oh yeah, I'm going to connect up with these 3 or 4 people. So at least they're double checked. So if you don't get one, somebody else will, because you have like 3 people check in. So there's a way in which those work. And we do have some really great technology now. I've seen some really amazing kind of WhatsApp groups, or what are some, there's a few other, the low band systems where all you have to do is turn your phone on once and boop, 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 a lot of things come in. You can send out, to keep people connected, and you have set up times like, okay, this time we're gonna like check in. So what are some of the others? We got some others. I saw some good stuff coming around food, local garden clubs, vegetable shares. Oh, rain gardens. Yeah. They have put in some things about rain gardens and for flood infrastructure. How can we start localizing our management of our floodwaters? Community gardens. Yeah, food is, I think, one of those interesting ones. Like I've seen community gardens, like growing food. So can we grow local food? And what do we mean? Because there's this piece in some of the communities I've been part of, they're like self-resilience. I'm going to do everything on my own, which is hard, like really hard. If you've ever tried it, you're like, oh, I need to be a good shoemaker and a good gardener, and I need to know how to do this and do that. And you're like, hours in a day, like skills, like, like I have a really great place for growing kale, but not a great place for growing garlic, like, but my friend has a great garlic place. So maybe they grow the garlic and I grow the kale and we trade. Or like, I like to travel, so I don't want to be around chickens. You're like, I'm never going to travel. I'll be the chicken person. I'm going to always be home because I'm not going anywhere. I'm a home person. And you travel, people, you travel. I'll take care of the chickens because I'm here every day. So how do we be community resilient and not individually resilient? Like when you think about resilience, it's not an individual game. It's like a neighborhood. It's a community. It's a collective game where the person on the hilltop grows the hilltop things and the people in the valley grow the valley things, and you work together, right? I think the community gardens work really well as a hub for that, where you can have multiple community gardens, have a lot going on, and engagement between them. I live urbanly right now. I live in an apartment, 4-story. I have no yard. Community gardens, awesome. Also, like random empty lot gardens, awesome. Grafting onto street trees so fruit grows, awesome. Like there's lots of ways we can engage. I even like get my guinea pigs, and I like have a guinea pig tractor, and I move them around and they like graze around, try to keep the lawnmowers down because I have a personal like resistance to lawnmowers these days.
One layer I'd love to just throw to that, Charles, because I'm hearing a lot of people that already kind of have some of these things in place. Like I was part of building a number of community gardens in a community I was a part of a number of years ago, but we were thinking about kind of feeding the needy and coming together for community. We were never actually thinking about resiliency in context to climate change and some of these challenges with it, right? And when I think back on those gardens, they were a beautiful thing for our garden, but they were actually very fragile gardens that we built because it just wasn't on our mindset. So I think maybe the question I'd like to pose to some folks tonight is, some of you are already listing these amazing things you have in the community. I love what Rose was saying, like, how do we leverage the strengths that are already there? And, if you don't have to build something from scratch, that's amazing. But maybe the question coming out of tonight is like, hey, what are some amazing systems that are already there? And have we actually put them into context to some of the changes we're seeing in the world and some of our worries? And could we very quickly as a community kind of just add or build or tweak or adapt these current systems to actually be real with some of the concerns we have right now? So that's just a question maybe I'll pose to folks coming out of this conversation.
So I'm seeing our time's kind of winding down. So I just want to do one more piece. I'm going to share my screen and come back to this. I saw many great things in the chat. I hope people are reading through it because there's like, seed libraries and tool libraries and shares. There's some really great ideas in there. So I hope people are capturing some of that and getting some inspiration, because they might seem like, oh yeah, we know this already. These little things make a difference. And I don't want to minimize the little things that make a difference. I think there's two major categories when I think about ecological analogs. One is that we need to reduce our dependence on large and fragile systems. So when you look at your life and you do the mapping Chris was talking about, you map out all the people, what are the large and fragile systems? What are the systems that are so large that you or your community have no agency in them, can't repair them, can't fix them, don't have the tools to do it, are really dependent on somebody else making it happen? What can you do to reduce your dependence on that? And some of those things are small things, but real. Things like dealing with the phantom load, which is like all the devices in our house that draw electricity when we are not using them. When we leave our computer plugged in and we're not using it, like it draws energy. When we have our TV that has a little light on or remembers all the things, like how can we reduce that phantom load? That's 5 to 10% of the energy use in a household. That means it's 5 to 10% of the energy use in a city. Like it's a huge amount of energy that we're then needing to be reliant on a large energy system. If we're not reliant on a large energy system, we can be reliant on a smaller one, and we can localize it more. Installing curtains, like there's some really great research around, if you improve your windows, and you've probably thought about this, if you own a home, like getting better windows so you lose less energy out of your windows is one of the big efficiencies you can do. However, if you had a single pane window, you could make a better efficient window for energy loss, heat loss, or heat entering with a really good curtain that covered the entire window, either floor to ceiling if you don't have heaters at the bottom, or inside the window frame, than you would by increasing to a triple pane window. Like it's easier to do, less expensive. Maybe it's not what you will want for long term, but for a low investment, you can have a high impact. So what can you do? Can we walk, bike, or roll to do what we need to do? And some of that is like, oh, I just need to make a slight lifestyle choice. And sometimes it is like my city has to design itself differently because I can't walk, bike, or roll to the thing I need. It's just too far away. So like, but can we reduce our dependence on these large energy intensive systems? Because they're the fragile things. Can we use more natural buildings? And this is one of those ones that I think doesn't always come to mind, but is our building systems and structures ones that we can repair with local resource? Or do we need to buy something from far away? Is there a supply chain? The city I'm in, they're building a school and they've extended by 4 years or 3 years so far. It's been because the supply chain keep getting disrupted. They just can't build the buildings because the local resources isn't here. So how can we start to look at different building styles that relate to our environments more appropriately? And then there's all the social stuff, make friends, connect with our neighbors, do that asset mapping, have a potluck, get to know who's in our community, who are the people who are vulnerable and how can we support them? Who are the people who have resources and things to offer? What are the gifts you bring because you have one? What is your gift? And then there's the R's, the reduce, reuse, repair, recycle. We think about it, upcycling the things we have. Because creating new is a huge driver of progress, but it is a huge driver of fragility in our system because it usually comes from other places. So how do we reduce our dependency? Like that's the one big chunk. And the other one is increase our capacity locally. What is your local capacity? Is it you or your neighborhood, your compound, your building, your city, your county? What is your neighborhood, your region, your valley, your watershed? I don't know what it is for you, but like, how do you increase the capacity? Local food, because food is critical. And it's not to say you can't eat things from far away. Like, I love tea. I live in Nova Scotia. We're not going to grow tea. Very sad. But, we'll bring that in. But I'm not going to be ruined if we don't have tea. Like, how can I get some of my food and support local agriculture? Because it's the other thing that keeps landscapes diverse, is like keeping them in natural things and not strip malls and parking lots. Keep development from happening, keep our farmers working, producing good local food, and then bring in extra food from other places. But how can we support our local food and farmers? Community gardens and the such. Community healthcare. And we haven't talked much about it on this conversation, but how do we take care of our healthcare? Is not always hospitals and it's not always clinics and pharmacies. There's herbalists and there's lots of different healers out there that can do work. Maybe they can't do everything, but there's a lot of healthcare that can be done locally, and find your local healers. People are prone to that. Your local midwives and your acupuncturists and your, all the sorts of healers you have, your mental support healers, like all of that needs to be part of our systems and accessible without having to go so far to find them or be so difficult to reach. So as I said, choose local utilities, This is power production. There's some really great designs for localized power production, either in your own home or your own building or local grids, or even local, having own local utilities, like small local utilities that really advocate for local power production and use and storage. There's stuff in your cities, which is your zoning. This would be if you're in cities, like engaging the local planning, though it might not be exciting to people, like, but it's how we change our cities so we can have walkable neighborhoods, so things can be close. So we can change the zoning so that it actually can be personable. So we can have shops on a street that might be considered, this is a neighborhood. It's that, there's no businesses here, but maybe on one corner you can have a small shop, or a little health clinic, or like how can we start to adjust it to really be serve the needs of our community. Community composting, another one. Like, where does our waste go to? We didn't talk about waste. We talked about inputs, like what do we need, like getting the things we need, but we have waste. What do we do with all the waste? Human waste, solid waste, liquid waste. How do we get rid of all that doesn't rely on systems that are fragile? Because that's just as much of a problem, and sometimes more of a health problem in the long term. Like once you start looking at disasters around the world, like having poor waste disposal has been a huge vector for sickness. So like, how do we deal with waste in our communities? How can we do that better? And your rainwater, and I talked a little bit about water. I really think we should think about our water systems and how can we localize some of our water that doesn't require big pumps and lots of energy. So a pitch for all those things of what we can do. There's a lot of great permaculture teachers, a lot of great sustainability people. Check out the stuff that are Earth Actors training. We have a whole bunch of things we teach. I have a whole class just on infrastructure, like sustainable infrastructure. What do we need to do? How to do it. And I do that in the later spring, early summer. So if you're interested in this or disaster stuff, Chris will be teaching on. As I said, we have this one on business. There's lots of components to resilience. Come join us for all those, and let's have more conversations. Lots of things in the chat. I'm gonna have to look through them, but I'm gonna pass it back to Chris as we start to wrap up. I'm gonna take a look at the chat, and I think we should wrap up and let these guys get back to their busy lives.
Yeah, thanks, Charles. Thank you, everybody, for taking some time to join with us tonight. I guess the only real closing thought I'd just like to share is, in some ways we shared a lot, and in some ways we just scratched the surface and didn't really dive in. So if you're still feeling in the like, oh my goodness, that was a lot, I just want to remind you of that whole idea of like that climax forest grows slowly. And, what is that next seed for you? And just realize if you stay consistent with that over time, it really does add up and it really does make a difference. So within your community, within your business, within your situation, what is that next seed for you that is growing this world that is more adaptable to change, that's more resilient, that's more sustainable, that's more resilient, that supports people and nature in a healthier way. So that's the question I'd like to encourage you to think about. It doesn't have to be changing your municipal zoning bylaws, although, writing a letter would be great. But what is that next little baby step? And if you're thinking about the baby step, is there one baby step that has leverage behind it? And thus that baby step is actually maybe a big step because of the leverage behind it. So that's what I'll leave everybody with tonight. Thanks so much for connecting with us, spending some time with us. Maybe we'll see some of you inside some of the courses coming up. I also have a bunch of in-person stuff going on. So any of the Ontario folks, if you check out my website, I got a bunch of in-person stuff coming on. And thank you for a lovely evening. Thank you for being courageous and willing to look at challenging topics with a positive and empowered mindset. So we'll leave it there.
Thank you, everybody. It's inspiring to sit with you all because I know you all are making a great difference in all your little ways and big ways. So